She ran through the rain, as if the night itself were chasing her. Serafina did not look back. Looking back was a habit she had trained herself out of years ago, because looking back meant remembering, and remembering was the one thing she could not afford. Her boots hit the wet stone of the road hard. Her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, and the small town of Miranvale appeared out of the dark fog, like a place that had always been forgotten, which was exactly why she had chosen it. She had been running for 6 years. Not always physically. Most of the time it was quieter than that. It was the kind of running that happened inside a person, the kind where you change your name and cut your hair, and learn to look people directly in the eye, so they never suspect you are afraid of them. She had become very good at that kind of running. She had become so good at it that some mornings she almost forgot who she really was. Almost. The clinic where she worked sat at the far edge of Miranvale, wedged between a grain merchant and a workshop that always smelled of cedar and iron. It was a plain building with a low door and 2 small windows, and it belonged to an older woman named Clara Holt, who had hired Serafina 3 years ago without asking too many questions. Clara was the kind of woman who understood that some people arrived in small towns with shadows behind their eyes, and she had the rare grace not to make them explain those shadows. Serafina had given her a simple name. She had said it plainly, and without blinking. Her name was Sarah Vine. She had trained under a healer in the East, and she was looking for quiet work. Clara had looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Serafina had felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to turn and walk away, and then Clara had nodded and said, "You can start tomorrow." That had been 3 years ago. Now Serafina was the one the people of Miranvale came to when their children had fevers that would not break. She was the one they trusted when the winter brought the old aching illness that settled in the bones of the elderly. She kept her head low. She wore her dark hair braided and tucked away. She kept her eyes, those strange silver eyes that had always been the one thing she could never fully hide, behind a pair of tinted lenses she had paid a traveling glassmaker to make for her specially. She spoke in a calm, even voice, and she smiled when it was appropriate, and she never stayed in any conversation longer than was necessary. She was invisible. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But plans, she had learned, were fragile things. It was a Wednesday morning when the first sign came that the world she had so carefully built was about to shake. She was preparing a batch of fever medicine, grinding dried bark into a fine powder at the long wooden table in the back room, when Clara pushed open the door with a look on her face that Serafina had never seen before. Clara was not a woman who alarmed easily. She had a steady way about her, the kind that came from decades of dealing with illness and grief and people at their lowest. So when Serafina saw the tightness around Clara's mouth and the careful way she was holding herself, she set down the mortar and said nothing, waiting. "There are soldiers on the road," Clara said. Serafina kept her face neutral. "How many?" 8, maybe 10. "They are wearing the king's colors." The king's colors were black and deep gold. Serafina knew them the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat, by instinct, and with a kind of dread that she could never fully shake. She had seen those colors once before, a long time ago, on a very different night. She had been 12 years old, and the men wearing those colors had not come in peace. She breathed in slowly through her nose. "What do they want?" "I do not know yet." They stopped at the square. "People are gathering." Clara paused. "Sarah, are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, and her voice was steady, and she meant it, because she had learned that meaning something was a choice, not a feeling. "Let me finish this batch. If they need a healer, they will find their way here." She turned back to the grinding stone and continued working. Her hands did not shake, but her mind was already moving. She ran through what she knew. Soldiers did not typically ride into small border towns unless there was a reason. A search, a summons, a plague investigation, or something worse. If it was a search, she needed to assess within the next hour whether she could leave quietly, or whether leaving would draw more attention than staying. If it was a summons of some kind, she needed to know who had been summoned and for what. She had learned, over 6 years, to always have 3 exits mapped in her head for any building she occupied regularly. She had 2 for the clinic, and a third through Clara's back garden that led out onto a lane behind the grain merchant. She was not panicking, she was calculating. That was the difference between the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The girl she had been had panicked the night her family's estate was burned. She had stood in the garden in her sleeping clothes, 12 years old and unable to move, watching the fire take the upper windows, while the screaming went on inside, and the men in black and gold surrounded the property with torches. The old elder, Marin, had found her there in the garden. Marin had been shaking, her white hair loose and her hands already cold, but her grip on Serafina's face had been firm. She had pressed her forehead to Serafina's and had begun to speak in the old tongue, words that felt like roots pushing down into the earth, like weight settling over Serafina's skin, like something being buried very deep and very deliberately. "This will hide what you are," Marin had said. "Not forever, but long enough, if you are careful." "What am I?" Serafina had asked, though she already knew. She had always known. "You are the last of House Auron," Marin had said. "And that is the most dangerous thing in the world to be tonight." She had pressed something into Serafina's hand, a pendant, small and dark, cool against her palm, and then she had stepped back into the burning estate, and Serafina had run. She had been running ever since. The soldiers did not come to the clinic that morning. By midday, Serafina had learned from a boy who came in with a cut on his hand and a mouthful of news that the soldiers had been passing through on their way to the larger town of Caldwick, 3 hours east, and had only stopped to water their horses. She let out a slow breath and returned to her work. But that evening, sitting in the small room she rented above the baker's shop 3 streets from the clinic, she took out the pendant and held it in her palm. It was no larger than a coin, worn smooth along its edges, and when she closed her fingers around it, she could feel the faintest warmth still living inside it. The seal was still holding, but she could feel, in some quiet, wordless part of herself that she had never been able to silence, that it was not as strong as it had been a year ago. Time was doing what time always did. Things weakened, things wore thin. She had maybe a year before the concealment began to fail on its own, maybe less. She placed the pendant back around her neck and tucked it beneath her collar. Then she lay down on the narrow bed, closed her eyes, and thought about what she would do when she had to run again. She had money saved. She had a horse she boarded at the edge of town, a quiet gray mare she had named Frost, who never made noise and always came when called. She had a small bag already packed in the bottom of her wardrobe, the way it had been packed for 6 years, because Serafina had learned that the thing most likely to get a person killed was the time wasted deciding what to take when they suddenly needed to leave. She was ready. She was always ready. What she was not ready for was the morning 3 weeks later, when the road to Mirenvale filled with a different kind of company entirely. Not 8 soldiers passing through, but 20 riders moving with purpose, and at the center of them, on a black horse that moved like it was barely tolerating the road beneath it, a man whose presence Serafina could feel before she even saw him clearly. She was crossing the square with a basket of herbs when the company rode in, and the first thing she noticed was the way the people of Mirenvale stopped. Not the polite stopping of people watching something interesting pass. The full, silenced stopping of people who recognized something powerful, and were responding to it the way all living creatures respond to something more dominant than themselves, with stillness and a kind of instinctive deference. The second thing she noticed was him. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with a preference for straight lines. He wore no crown. He did not need one. There was something about him that communicated his position without any decoration, the way he sat on the horse, the way every rider around him positioned themselves in relation to him without appearing to think about it, the way even the horse seemed to understand it was carrying something that mattered. King Darren Ashvale. Serafina had never seen him in person. She had heard his name spoken carefully, the way people spoke the names of storms, with a mixture of respect and caution. He had taken the throne 4 years ago when his father died, and in those 4 years, the kingdom had not softened. If anything, it had sharpened around him, the way a blade sharpens when someone who knows what they are doing picks it up. She turned away and walked at a steady pace back toward the clinic. She did not run. Running drew attention. But every part of her was alert in a way it had not been in years, her awareness spreading out around her like something animal and old, reading the air, reading the distance between herself and the clinic door, reading the sound of the horses slowing as they reached the center of the square. She was 10 steps from the clinic when she heard a voice, not shouted, not raised, but carrying the way the voices of men like him always carried, as if the air itself made room for the sound. Is there a healer in this town? She did not stop. She reached the clinic door and pushed it open. Clara was inside, already at the window. They are asking for a healer, Clara said quietly. I heard, Serafina said. She set her basket down on the table and began unpacking it with careful hands. Sarah. I know. If it is what people are saying, if the plague has reached the border villages, then they need someone who knows the old remedies. And in this town, that is you. Serafina's hands stilled on a bundle of dried root. She stared at it for a moment. She thought about Frost, boarded at the edge of town. She thought about the bag in the bottom of her wardrobe. She thought about Marin, and the feel of the seal being placed on her, and the word that had been pressed into her like a stone pressed into soft earth, careful. Then she thought about the border villages. She knew which ones. She had passed through 2 of them on her way to Miranvale 6 years ago, and she remembered the children standing in the doorways of low houses, watching the road with the wide, patient eyes of children who had learned that something was always about to change. She thought about those children with a fever that would not break. She thought about what it would cost her to turn away. She picked up the bundle of dried root and placed it in the storage jar. Tell them I will come out, she said. Clara looked at her with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite worry. Then she nodded and went to the door. Serafina took one moment, just one, to check the pendant at her collar. It was there. It was warm. The seal was holding. She smoothed her braid back, settled her coat, and arranged her face into the expression she had spent years perfecting. Calm, professional, completely ordinary. Then she walked to the door and stepped outside. The king was still on his horse. His eyes moved to her the moment she appeared, and she felt it. The exact moment his gaze found her, like a hand pressing flat against her sternum. She did not flinch. She met his eyes for precisely as long as was natural for a healer meeting a new patient's family, and then she moved her gaze to the man beside him, who was clearly a high-ranking officer of some kind, waiting for the proper person to address. I am the healer here, she said. Her voice was even. What do you need? There was a pause. She was aware of the king watching her. She was aware of it the way you are aware of standing near a fire. Not because the fire is doing anything particular, but because fire is fire, and proximity to it is never truly neutral. We need you to come with us, the officer said. Serafina looked at him steadily. For how long? The officer opened his mouth, then the king spoke, and his voice was exactly as she had expected it to be. Low, direct, and carrying the particular quality of a person who had not needed to repeat himself in a very long time. As long as it takes, he said. The villages on my eastern border are sick. My people say the illness is unlike anything they have treated before. Your name was given to me by a physician in Caldwick, who said you know remedies that others do not. She looked at him then. She let herself look, briefly and without reaction. His eyes were dark, almost black in the morning light, and there was nothing easy in them. He was not a man who made requests. He was a man who stated what was going to happen, and waited for the world to arrange itself accordingly. I will need to gather my supplies, she said. He nodded once, as if this was simply the next step in something already decided. She turned and went back inside the clinic. Clara was right behind her, already pulling boxes from the shelves. Serafina moved quickly, but without rushing, selecting the things she would need and packing them into the large carry case she kept for exactly this kind of work. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running through every calculation it needed to run. She was going into the heart of the kingdom she had been hiding from for 6 years. She was going to walk into the palace, because that was where this ended. She could see the shape of it already. And she was going to do it deliberately. And she was going to do it while carrying a secret that could destroy her the moment it was found. She picked up the carry case. She checked the pendant one more time. If I do not come back within 2 months, she said to Clara quietly, take what you need from the cabinet under the window, and do not wait for me. Clara caught her hand. Sarah. I will be careful, Serafina said, and she meant it, and she stepped back out into the morning light, where the king of the wolf kingdom was waiting, and the horses were restless, and the road stretched east, like something that had already made its decision. She walked toward it without hesitation. That was the thing about Serafina. She had been running for 6 years, but she had never once looked like it. It took less than a day of riding before Serafina understood exactly what she had walked into. The company moved fast. They did not stop to rest at the usual intervals. and no one complained about it, which told her something significant about the kind of men the king kept around him. She rode near the middle of the group, not at the back where she might be forgotten, but not at the front, where she might be noticed too much. She had spent years perfecting the art of positioning herself exactly where the eye naturally skipped over, and she applied that skill now with the same quiet discipline she applied to everything. The king rode at the front with his beta, a lean, watchful man named Corin, who had the kind of stillness about him that Serafina recognized as trained rather than natural. Behind them rode the rest, in a loose formation that spoke of long familiarity. These men had ridden together many times. They moved like a single organism when the terrain required it, spreading without instruction when the road narrowed, pulling back together when it widened. She studied all of them from beneath her lashes and said nothing. What she noticed most was the king himself. She tried not to, because noticing him required looking at him, and looking at him carried a risk she could not fully name or reason with. It was not the ordinary risk of being seen by someone powerful. It was something else, a pull that had no explanation in logic, something that her buried instincts kept nudging her toward like a current in water pushing a leaf in a direction the leaf had not chosen. She pressed it down firmly, and looked at the road. They reached the first of the border villages by late afternoon. It was called Henwick, and it had the particular silence of a place where many people were unwell at the same time, a stillness that was not peaceful, but strained, like a breath being held. The village elder, an older man named Graham, came to meet them at the edge of the settlement with red-rimmed eyes and hands that he could not quite keep still. "Your Majesty," Graham said, bowing, "thank you for coming. We have 43 people down with it now. 3 of them are children under 5. Serafina was already off her horse and reaching for her carry case before the king had finished responding. She looked at Graham directly. "Take me to the worst ones first," she said. Graham looked at the king, as if checking whether this was acceptable. The king gave a single small nod, and Graham led Serafina into the village. What she found in the low houses of Henwick confirmed what she had already suspected from the description she had been given during the ride. This was not a common illness. It moved through the body in a specific pattern, settling first in the chest, then moving to the blood, then to the skin, and she recognized that pattern because she had read about it once, years ago, in a very old text that most healers had never had access to. It was a text from the Auran archive, her family's library. The illness had a name. It was old and it was rare, but it was not without a cure, and the cure was not simple, but it was known to her. She spent 3 hours in Henwick. She examined every person who had fallen ill, asked detailed questions, and made notes in the small leather journal she carried. When she came back out to where the king's company was waiting near the well, the light had gone orange and low, and the king was standing rather than sitting, his arms crossed and his eyes on the door she had come through. He looked at her when she emerged. "Well," he said. It was not really a question, but she answered it as if it were. "I know what it is," she said. "I know how to treat it. It will take time and specific ingredients, some of which I do not have with me, but can source. The illness can be stopped, but not quickly. Anyone who is already deeply in it will need 3 to 4 weeks of careful treatment." He studied her for a moment. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a brief, sharp attention that felt like being measured, without the measuring being unkind. "How do you know what this is?" "My court physicians could not identify it." "I read widely," she said, which was true, and not enough of an answer, and she held his gaze steadily while she said it, and she watched him decide, very deliberately, to let it go. "You will come back to the palace," he said. "You will oversee the treatment from there. I will have everything you need sourced. And the people here? They will be attended to daily by my riders. You will tell them what to do. You will direct the treatment." He paused. "Is that acceptable to you?" The question surprised her, not because it was polite. She had expected a degree of civility from him, given what she had heard, but because it seemed genuinely to wait for her answer, as if her answer might change something. She looked at him carefully for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Yes," she said, "that is acceptable." The palace appeared the following morning through the trees, like something that had grown, rather than been built. Massive and dark, and sure of itself, settled into the landscape, as if the land had shaped itself around it, rather than the other way around. Serafina kept her eyes on it as they rode closer, and reminded herself to breathe evenly. She had known, intellectually, that she would end up here. The logic of the situation had pointed toward it from the moment she had stepped out of the clinic. But knowing something intellectually and arriving at it in body were two different experiences, and her body, which remembered things her mind had worked hard to forget, was sending signals up her spine that she translated and dismissed one by one. The gates opened as the king approached. Guards on both sides moved with precision, and the company passed through into a wide courtyard paved in dark stone. Grooms came forward to take the horses. People moved around the king with the practiced choreography of a court that ran on routine, and he moved through all of it with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged where he stood. Serafina dismounted and held her carry case and waited. A young man appeared at her elbow, orderly, neat, slightly anxious. "I am to take you to the medical wing," he said. "Thank you," she said. She followed him without looking back. The medical wing was better equipped than she had expected. It was a long room, with high windows and good light, with shelves of supplies along one wall and a row of examination tables along the other. There was a smaller attached room with a workbench for preparing medicine, and beyond that, a simple sleeping room that she understood was meant for her. She moved through all of it quickly, assessing, noting what was present and what was absent, already building the treatment plan in her mind. By evening she had sent a list of required ingredients to Corin, the king's beta, who had arrived at the wing's door with the focused expression of a man who was accustomed to acting on information efficiently. He read her list without comment, nodded, and left. The following morning, everything on her list had arrived. She began to work. For the first several days, she was left almost entirely alone, which suited her perfectly. She prepared the base medicines, sent clear written instructions to the riders going out to Henwick and to the other 2 villages that had since reported illness, and kept meticulous records of every patient's condition as the reports came back. The work steadied her. It was what she was good at, and goodness at a thing, she had found, was its own kind of anchor. When she was working, she did not think about what she was hiding. She thought only about what she was doing. On the 4th day, the king came to the medical wing. She heard him before she saw him, not because he made noise, but because the small sounds of the wing changed when he arrived at the door. The orderly who brought her meals went quieter. The air seemed to rearrange itself slightly. She was at the workbench, grinding a compound, and she did not stop. "You work long hours," he said from the doorway. "The illness does not observe regular hours," she said, without turning. She heard him come further into the room. She tracked his position by the sound, placing him at about 6 feet behind her and to the left, near the shelves. She continued grinding. "Corin tells me the reports from Henwick are already improving," he said. "They should be. I had them change the morning treatment first, because that is where the error was. The usual fever remedies were making the illness settle deeper, instead of drawing it out. It is counterintuitive. And you knew this, because you read widely." His tone was not mocking. It was flat, in the particular way of someone who had noticed that an answer was incomplete, and had filed that observation away, rather than acting on it immediately. "I did," she said. A pause. She kept grinding. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sarah Vine," she said. Another pause. She felt it stretch, and in the stretching of it, she became very conscious of the pendant at her collar. Cool now, settled against her skin. "Where are you from, Sarah Vine?" "The eastern settlements," she said. "A small place. Not worth naming." She turned then, because not turning would have been stranger than turning, and she looked at him with the direct, professional calm she kept as carefully as she kept everything else. He was looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she met them steadily and waited. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked. "Is the room adequate?" She blinked, genuinely, slightly surprised. "It is more than adequate, thank you." He nodded once and turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. "If you need anything," he said, "tell Corin." "I will," she said. He left. She stood at the workbench for a moment after he was gone, her hand still on the grinding stone, and let herself feel the exact dimensions of the situation she was in. She was inside the palace of the king, whose father had signed her family's destruction. She was working under that king's direct authority. She was helping his people, and somewhere beneath the carefully constructed surface of the woman called Sarah Vine, the last daughter of House Oren, was very still, and very watchful, and very much not yet ready to be found. She went back to grinding. She had work to do. The visits continued. He came on the 5th day and stood at the window and looked out at the courtyard while she described the progress she had made with the compound ratios. He came on the 7th day and looked at the patient records she had spread across the workbench and asked specific questions about 2 of them: the elderly man in Henwick who was not improving as quickly as she had expected, and a young woman in the 2nd village whose symptoms had taken an unusual course. She answered him directly, without simplifying, and he listened to the full answers without losing the thread of them, which told her something about the quality of his attention. On the 9th day he brought a chair. Not dramatically. He simply arrived at the medical wing, and there was a chair in his hand, and he placed it across from her workbench and sat down in it, and she looked at this development for a moment and said nothing, and returned to her work. He stayed for an hour that day. He did not interfere. He read papers he had brought with him, and she worked on the compounds, and occasionally, one of them said something that the other responded to, and then there was quiet again, and the quality of that quiet was not uncomfortable. It was the quality of 2 people who were both doing something real and did not need to fill the space between them with noise. She noticed this and did not examine it. She was very careful about which things she examined and which she left alone. The 9th day was also the day she first became aware of Lord Sesson watching her. She had seen him in the main corridors twice before without particular attention. He was a tall, sharp-featured man who wore his authority the way certain people wore well-cut clothing, as something inseparable from how he moved through the world. But on the 9th day she passed him in the corridor outside the medical wing, and felt his gaze settle on her with a quality she recognized immediately, the particular attention of someone who had decided you were worth studying. She kept walking. She did not alter her pace or her expression. But she noted him the way she noted everything that mattered, which was completely and without reaction. That evening, the king came to the wing again. It was later than his previous visits. The window had gone dark, and she was working by lamplight, reviewing the day's reports from the villages. He sat down in the chair. The chair was still there. Someone had left it, and no one had moved it. And he looked at the stack of papers on the edge of the bench. "May I?" he said. She looked at him. He was asking permission to look at her work. "Yes," she said. He picked up the top report and read it. He read it carefully, which she could tell by the way his eyes moved across the page. Then he set it down and picked up the next one. "You organize your records differently from my court physicians," he said. "Their system groups patients by location," she said. "Mine groups by symptom stage. It is more useful for tracking the progression of the illness." He considered this. "Can you show me?" She showed him. She moved around the bench and spread the reports out in the order she kept them, and walked him through the system. The color marks she used for stage 1 through stage 4, the notation system for medicine dosage, the way she tracked improvements against a baseline she established on the first day of treatment. He followed it, asked 2 questions that were precisely the right questions to ask, and then sat back and looked at the organized spread of papers. "This is cleaner than anything my physicians produce," he said. "It is a system I built for the specific illness," she said. "It would need to be adapted for other conditions." "Could you teach it?" She looked at him. "If needed." "I would like you to," he said, not with urgency. As a preference stated simply, the way he stated most things. She nodded and began gathering the papers back into order. He watched her work for a moment. "Why Mirenvale?" he said. She did not stop moving the papers. "I am sorry?" "Of all the places you could have gone," he said, "why did you choose Mirenvale? It is not close to anything. There are larger towns with better equipped clinics. Why there?" She aligned the last paper with the edge of the stack and considered her answer. She could give him the practical reason. It was far from the major pack territories. It was overlooked. It had a clinic that needed help and an owner who did not ask questions. All of these things were true. "It was quiet," she said, "and quiet was what I needed." He looked at her for a moment with those eyes that held more behind them than his face generally showed. "What were you running from?" he said. The question was very still, not aggressive, not probing, just present, in the way he was generally present, without apology or performance. She set the stack of papers down. "I was not running from anything," she said. and met his eyes with the full, steady directness she had been cultivating for 6 years. I was choosing carefully where to be. A pause. There is a difference, he said. Yes, she said, there is. He did not push further. He picked up his own papers from the chair where he had set them, and stood. And at the door, he paused in the way she was beginning to recognize, as simply part of how he moved through exits. Always that last moment of pause. Always something at the threshold. You are very careful, he said. Not critically. Observationally. I have found it useful, she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he left, and she turned back to the workbench, and held very still for a count of 5. He was not going to stop asking questions. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who circled a thing from different angles until he understood its shape, and she was a thing he had not yet understood, and she could feel his interest in understanding her, the way you feel the sun, not always directly, but always present. She needed to be very careful. She pressed the pendant at her collar and breathed. The seal held. For now. The reports that came in from the villages over the next week were encouraging. The patient in Henwick who had been slow to improve, an older man named Peter, tough and stubborn, who had apparently refused to rest for the first 3 days on the grounds that the harvest was not yet finished, finally showed measurable improvement when Serafina sent a revised treatment plan that accounted for his particular body type and medical history. The young woman in the second village stabilized. The numbers moved steadily in the right direction. She sent reports to Corin each morning. She trained the orderly, whose name she still did not know, since he had not offered it and she had not pushed for it, in the basics of the compound preparation, so that the daily batches could be sent to the villages without requiring her presence every morning. She worked. She slept a few hours each night. She ate the meals that arrived on the tray without particularly tasting them, because eating was a requirement of continuing to function, and she treated it with the same efficiency she treated other requirements. And she thought about the seal. She thought about it every morning when she checked the pendant, and every evening when she placed it on the small table beside the narrow bed. She thought about the warmth of it, which had been constant for 6 years, and was now, very slightly, variable. Some mornings it ran warmer than others, some evenings it cooled faster than it should have. She was monitoring it the way she monitored her patients, with precision, and without the comfort of pretending the numbers meant something different from what they meant. The seal was burning faster here. She had adjusted her timeline. She now believed she had 3 weeks before the concealment showed the first visible cracks. 4, if she was disciplined about limiting her proximity to the things that accelerated the wear. This meant limiting the length of the king's visits, which she could not control. It meant managing her own responses to the pull, that wordless current-like thing that moved between them more strongly every day, and which she dismissed every time with the same patient, practiced firmness. She was managing it. She had managed harder things. On the 14th day, a young boy came in with his mother. He was 7 years old, and his name was Owen, and he had been running a fever for 5 days, and when Serafina sat down to examine him, he looked at her with large, exhausted eyes and said, "Are you going to make it stop?" She looked at him very directly, the way she looked at all her young patients, because children knew when adults were being honest with them, and responded to honesty better than to comfort. "Yes," she said, "I am going to make it stop." She gave him a tea that worked quickly in small bodies, and sat with him for a few minutes while the initial effects set in. She put her hand on his forehead, clinical habit, checking temperature, and felt the familiar, unfamiliar sensation move through her palm like a river finding a channel, warm and precise, going from her into him. She pulled her hand back. His color was already better. She told herself it was the tea. She told herself this in the firm, deliberate way she told herself things that needed to be believed. The tea worked quickly in small bodies. That was all. But in the corridor outside, alone for a moment, she pressed her hand against the wall and looked at her palm and felt the edge of something she could not name and could not afford. She was running out of time. She went back to the workbench. She began working faster. Lord Sesson had been at the palace for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had learned to recognize a threat in the shape of something harmless. He had seen it too many times. The quiet advisor who turned out to be reporting to a rival pack. The mild-mannered trade negotiator who was siphoning resources from the border agreements. the soft-spoken attendant who had been placed in the court specifically to observe the king at close range. Danger, in Sesson's considerable experience, almost never announced itself loudly. Danger wore ordinary clothing, and spoke in measured voices, and kept its eyes slightly lowered. The woman from Miranvale wore ordinary clothing. She spoke in a measured voice. She kept her eyes slightly lowered. Sesson found her deeply interesting. He did not make his suspicion visible. That would have been amateur, and Sesson was not an amateur. He simply began to pay attention in his particular, methodical way. He noted when she arrived at the medical wing in the morning, and when she left at night. He noted what she requested, who she spoke to, and who came to speak to her. He noted that she had no family she mentioned, no pack affiliation she referenced, and no history beyond the vague claim of Eastern settlements that she had apparently given the king. He noted that the king had now visited the medical wing 4 times in 8 days, which was 4 times more than the king had visited the medical wing in any comparable period in Sesson's memory. This last observation he turned over carefully before drawing any conclusions. The king was not a man led by feeling. He was not, in Sesson's assessment, the kind of man who wandered toward a pretty face out of simple interest. If the king was visiting the medical wing with increasing frequency, there was something he was responding to that had not yet declared itself, and Sesson wanted to know what it was before it declared itself to everyone else. Serafina, meanwhile, was trying very hard not to know what she knew. She knew that the king came to the wing because something was pulling him there. She could feel it, the same way she could feel the pull on her own side, the one she dismissed every single time with the same patient, deliberate firmness she would use to push a door closed against the wind. She knew what it meant. She had known what it meant since the first morning in the square, when his gaze had found her with that precise, landslide quality, and something inside her had shifted in a way she had no name for, and no interest in naming. She was his mate. The word sat in the middle of her chest like a stone. She did not examine it. She did not let herself examine it, because examining it would require feeling it, and feeling it was not something she could afford. She had spent 6 years becoming a person who did not have the luxury of her own feelings, and she was not going to undo that work now, in the palace of the man she was most in danger from, because her blood recognized his. She focused on the work. The work, at least, was going well. By the end of the 2nd week, the reports from all 3 affected villages showed measurable improvement. The patients who had been worst off were stabilizing. The children were recovering fastest, as children often did, and she received a brief note from the village elder in Henwick, old Graham, with his red-rimmed eyes, that said simply, "2 of the young ones sat up and asked for bread this morning. Thank you." She folded the note and put it in her pocket, and carried it for the rest of the day. That evening, the king came to the wing at an unusual hour. It was later than his previous visits. The sky outside the high windows had gone dark, and she had a single lamp burning on the workbench where she was reviewing the day's reports. She heard the change in the air and looked up. He was in the doorway in plainer clothing than she usually saw him in, still dark, still well made, but without the formal layering of the day. His presence was no less significant for the informality. If anything, it was slightly worse, because he seemed slightly less like a king, and slightly more like a person. She sat up straight. "You are working late," he said. "The reports from the 2nd village came in after dinner. I wanted to review them tonight." He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her workbench, not asking permission, not making it a question, simply sitting down with the ease of a man in a space he had decided was available to him. She watched him do it with an expression she kept carefully neutral. He picked up one of the reports from the edge of the bench and looked at it. "Can you read this to me?" She glanced at him. "Can you not read it yourself?" "I can read it," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but had its roots in the same place. "I am asking you to read it to me." She looked at him for a moment. This king who was sitting across from her in the lamplight, asking her to read him a medical report at an unusual hour, and she felt the pull again, that warm, steady, impossible thing, and she pushed it down and picked up the report and began to read. She read him the numbers, the patient counts, the temperature records, the medicine quantities, the improvement rates. He listened without interrupting, his elbows on his knees, watching her in a way she could feel without looking up. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You are very precise," he said. "Medicine requires precision. Most people soften bad news. You did not soften the numbers from the second village, even though they are worse than the first. Softening numbers does not change them, she said. It only changes what decisions are made about them. He looked at her with that sharp, filing attention again. You think clearly, he said. I try to, she said, and she kept her voice professional, and her eyes on the report, and she did not say what was also true, which was that she had learned to think clearly, because feeling things clearly had become too dangerous. Clarity was the armor she had built over 6 years of careful, solitary survival, and she wore it well. He stood to go. At the door, he paused in the way she was beginning to understand was a habit of his, pausing at exits, as if something at the last moment asked for his attention. The elder from Henwick sent a letter, he said. He asked me to pass his thanks to the healer. I told him I would. She kept her face still. I know. He wrote to me as well. Something crossed the king's face, something brief and complicated that she could not read before he shut it down. Of course he did, he said, and left. She sat at the workbench for a long time after. The lamp burned quietly. The palace settled around her. She pressed her hand to the pendant at her collar. It was still warm. But she had been in this palace for 2 weeks now, and she was aware, in that precise, wordless way she was aware of things that mattered, that the seal was not as strong as it had been the morning she arrived. Proximity to him was costing her something. The warmth in the pendant was not comfort. It was effort. The seal was working harder than it had worked in years, and working hard meant it was burning through the time she had left. She needed to finish the treatment. She needed to give the palace healers everything they needed to continue without her. And then she needed to leave. She had 1 month, maybe less. She picked up the next report and began to read. Outside the windows, the palace slept, and somewhere in its eastern corridor, the king stood at his own window in the dark and looked out at the sky, and for the first time in 3 years, something inside him, deep and old and wolf-shaped, was restless. He did not know why yet. He would. The first sign was so small that Serafina almost missed it. She was washing her hands at the basin in the workroom, the early morning light just beginning to come through the high windows, when she glanced down and saw it. A faint luminescence on her palms. Not light exactly, but something like it. A warmth made visible. It was there for 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and then it was gone, leaving her palms looking ordinary and slightly damp. She stood very still. Then she dried her hands, turned back to the workbench, and reviewed every interaction from the previous day, with the focused intensity of someone reading a map they needed to memorize before it was taken away. She was looking for the moment that had caused it, the crack that had let something through. She found it quickly. The previous afternoon, the boy Owen had been brought back for a follow-up, and she had checked his temperature again, and when she had placed her hand on his forehead the feeling had returned. That sensation of something moving through her palm, purposeful and warm. She had pulled away faster this time, but not before she had felt it clearly. She had told herself it was the medicine. She told herself this again now, standing at the basin. The tea worked quickly in small bodies, but she was looking at her palms, and she knew. The seal was not just weakening, it was becoming permeable. The thing she was, the thing she had been born as, the thing Marin had buried beneath 6 years of careful concealment, was starting to push through at the edges, not visibly yet, not in ways anyone around her could identify. But the luminescence on her palms was not nothing. She had less time than she had thought. She returned to the workbench and pulled out the treatment schedule she had been building for the palace healers, the document that would allow them to continue managing the border village recovery after she left. She had been working on it steadily, intending to have it completed within 3 weeks. She was going to have to finish it in 1. She began working faster. The problem was that the king kept coming to the wing. She could not stop him from coming. He was the king. She could not say, "Please stop visiting this room. I am trying to manage a concealment that is failing, and your proximity is accelerating the problem." She could not say, "Every time you sit across from me at this workbench and ask me to explain what I am doing, something in me responds to you in a way that burns through the seal a little faster." She could not say any of this, so instead she said things like, "The third village is responding well, and I recommend increasing the morning dose for the elderly patients." And she kept her eyes on the reports and her hands busy and her voice even. He noticed the change anyway. She could tell. He did not say anything. He was not, she had learned, a man who named things he was still observing. But there was a new quality to his attention during his visits. He watched her the way she imagined he watched a problem he had not yet solved. Steadily. Without urgency. But without any intention of stopping. Corin noticed too, in his different way. The beta said nothing, and moved around her with the particular careful deference of someone who was not quite sure what he was being careful about, but had decided to be careful anyway. The one who worried her most, though, was Sesson. She had been aware of Sesson from the beginning. He had the eyes of a man who looked for things, and he had the patience of a man who had found things that way before. She had caught him watching her twice from across the courtyard, and once from the corridor outside the medical wing, at an angle that told her he was not passing by, but standing deliberately at a spot where he could observe, without appearing to observe. She knew that game. She had played it herself. She did not react to him. Reacting would tell him something. Instead, she continued to be exactly what she appeared to be, a healer, doing her job, with the quiet competence of someone who had done it for years, and she noted his attention, and filed it, and continued working. 10 days into her accelerated schedule, she was preparing the evening medicines when the second sign came. She was reaching for a jar on the high shelf, and her sleeve fell back from her wrist, and in the lamplight, she saw it clearly. A thin line of silver running along the inside of her forearm. Not a scar, not a mark anyone had put there. It was her own nature, surfacing through the skin, a trace of what she was, written in her own blood, becoming visible. She pulled her sleeve down immediately. She stood at the shelf with her arm against her side, and breathed through the implications. The silver marking was not something she could hide with tinted lenses or a carefully arranged braid. If it spread, and it would spread, if the seal continued to weaken, it would be visible even through fabric in certain lights. She had perhaps 2 weeks before she would need to start wearing long sleeves in all weather, and perhaps a week beyond that before even that would not be enough. She needed to leave in less than 2 weeks. She finished the evening medicines and went to the sleeping room and lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and made her calculations. The document for the palace healers could be completed in 10 days if she worked every available hour. The treatment for the border villages was at a stable enough point that it could be handed off. There was nothing keeping her here except the king's authority, and the king's authority could be worked around if she framed her departure correctly, as a completion rather than a flight. She could do this. She had done harder things. She closed her eyes, and she was almost into sleep when the door of the medical wing opened. Not her sleeping room door, but the main door, across the corridor, the particular sound of it that she had learned to identify in the past weeks. She heard footsteps that she also recognized, and then stillness. He was in the wing. She did not move. She lay on the narrow bed with her eyes closed and her breathing even, and the thin silver line inside her forearm pressed against the rough blanket, and she listened to him stand in the room next door in the middle of the night, not going to the shelves, not looking at the reports, just standing there. She did not know what he was standing there for. She suspected he did not either. After several minutes, she heard the door close. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was dark and plain above her, and the palace was quiet, and the pendant at her collar was burning warm now, in a way that no longer felt like comfort. It felt like an engine running too fast. It felt like something being held in place by a grip that was slowly, inevitably, running out of strength. She pressed her hand to it. "Hold," she said quietly, to herself, to the seal, to whatever remained of Marin's gift. Just a little longer. The pendant pulsed once, gently, like an answer. She closed her eyes again, and did not sleep until nearly dawn. The day it happened, she had been in the palace for 23 days. She was not expecting it to happen that day. She was not expecting it to happen at all on her terms. She had known, somewhere in the part of her that was honest with itself, that the seal failing was not going to be a quiet private moment. It was going to be the way walls came down, suddenly and all at once, and with no consideration for whether the person inside was ready. But she had hoped, because hope was the last thing to leave a careful person, that she would be gone before it became relevant. She had 10 pages left on the handover document. 10 pages, 2 more days of work, and then she would speak to Corin and arrange her departure. She had been so close. She was in the corridor outside the medical wing, carrying a box of medicines to be sent to the second village with the morning riders. The box was heavier than she had accounted for, and she was concentrating on the angle of it, and she turned the corner into the lower hall, and Sessin was there. He was not alone. 2 palace guards stood with him. She clocked them before she registered Sessin's expression, and his expression told her everything she needed to know in the space between one step and the next. This was not an accidental meeting in a corridor. He had been waiting here. He had chosen this location specifically because it was a section of the palace with no other witnesses during the morning hour. She had noticed this about the lower hall herself during her first week, and she recognized now, a beat too late, that he had noticed it for the same reason. She kept walking at the same pace. She was 3 steps from him when he spoke. "Sarah Vine," he said, "I wonder if you could help me with something." She stopped. She held the box in both arms and looked at him calmly. "Of course, my lord." He smiled, and the smile did not reach anything behind it. "I have been trying to locate your records," he said. "Your training records, your healer certification, your pack registration, the usual documents we keep for all members of the palace staff." He paused, watching her with those filing eyes. "We cannot seem to find them." "I am not palace staff," she said. "I was summoned by the king for a specific purpose." "Even so," he said, "the palace requires documentation from anyone living within its walls. It is a matter of security." He tilted his head slightly. "You understand." She understood completely. He was telling her he had been looking for her in documents that did not exist, because the woman called Sarah Vine had no paper history. Sarah Vine had been a name chosen for its ordinariness, not for its verifiability. "I will speak to Corin about providing whatever is needed," she said evenly. "Of course," said Sessin. He took 1 step toward her, and his hand moved, and she saw it coming, and she turned her shoulder, but his reach was longer than she had estimated, and his fingers caught the chain at her collar, and in the half-second before she could step back, the chain snapped. The pendant fell. The seal broke. She felt it go the way you feel a sound more than hear it, a change in the air around her, a sudden vast inhaling, like the world taking in a breath it had been holding for years. The concealment that had lived on her skin for 6 years dissolved like morning frost in one clean, unstoppable instant, and what it left behind was everything it had been hiding. The lower hall went white. Not blindingly, not in the way that hurt, but with a sudden, clean, silver-gold light that poured from her like water released from cupped hands. She stood in it. She could not stop it. She had not had to contain it for so long that her body had forgotten the discipline, and even if it had remembered, there was nothing to contain it with now. The pendant was on the floor. The seal was gone. Sessin stumbled back 2 steps. One of the guards dropped to one knee. The other followed before he seemed to understand why he was doing it. Sessin, to his credit, did not kneel. He pressed back against the wall and looked at her with eyes that had finally found the thing they had been searching for. And in them, she could see not triumph, but something more complicated. Something that looked almost like the understanding that he had badly misjudged the scale of what he had been looking for. She bent and picked up the pendant from the floor. She held it in her closed fist. The light was fading already. It had lasted perhaps 15 seconds in its full expression, and she was pulling herself in, rebuilding walls by will alone now, without the seal to support them. She could do it, partly. Enough to be presentable, not enough to fully disappear again. The light settled into something lower, a faint silver luminescence that played at the edges of her, just visible enough to be undeniable. She looked at Sessin. "Now you know," she said. Her voice was steady. She heard footsteps. Then the king was in the corridor. He must have been nearby. The lower hall was off the main eastern passage, and the light would have been visible under the door. He came around the corner and stopped. His eyes went to the guards on their knees, to Sessin pressed against the wall, to the faint silver light still playing at the edges of the woman standing in the middle of the hall with a broken chain in her fist, and her eyes completely uncovered for the first time. Silver, fully silver, the color of deep water in moonlight, the color that was in every old text about the Orin bloodline. He looked at her. The thing that happened inside him, Serafina felt as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat, because the blood bond between mates was not subtle, and with her seal gone, there was nothing between her and the full force of it. She felt his wolf surge. She felt it the way you feel a wave hit before you hear it, the way you feel a door open from across the room. 3 years of silence, she would learn later. 3 years of his wolf refusing to wake. And now, in this corridor, it rose all at once. Mate. She stood very still. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she did not move, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, and the way his breathing had changed, and the line of his jaw working through something he had not yet decided how to say. "Who are you?" he said. It was the right question. She had always known he would ask it this way, not with anger yet, not with accusation, but with the directness of a man, encountering a fact he needed to understand. She met his eyes. "I am Serafina Oren," she said, "the last of my house. I have been hiding from the consequences of your father's choices for 6 years, and I did not come here to be found." The corridor was very quiet. Sesson had not moved from the wall. The king looked at her for a long time, and she looked back at him, and the faint silver light played quietly between them. "Oren," he said, very low. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for another long, still moment, and she could see the calculation in it, the same way she might look at a piece of information that changed the shape of everything around it and needed to be accounted for before anything else could be decided. Then his face closed. She had known it would. She had been watching for it. She watched the king come back and the person recede, and she stood very still and let it happen, because she had always known this was how it would go when the day came. "Take her to the east room," he said. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to Corin, who had appeared at his shoulder. "Your Majesty," Corin said quietly. "She is not under arrest," the king said. "She is under protection. There is a difference." He paused, and his eyes came back to her one more time. "We will speak this evening." He turned and walked away. Serafina watched him go. She uncurled her hand and looked at the broken pendant in her palm. 6 years of her life had lived inside this small, worn thing. She closed her fingers around it again, gently, the way you close your fingers around something that is gone. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned to follow Corin. She had known, from the very beginning, that it would end here. She had known that the seal would break, that the light would come, that the name she had buried would surface. She had known she could not run forever. She had just hoped she might have the chance to choose when to stop. That was the thing about plans. They could be perfect in every detail and still end in a corridor you had not accounted for, at the hands of a man who had been looking for the wrong thing and found something far larger than he bargained for. She followed Corin through the palace, her head level and her spine straight and the broken pendant in her closed fist, and she did not look back. She never looked back. The east room was not a cell. It had a window that looked over the inner garden, a bed with clean linen, a writing table, and a lamp. A tray of food arrived within the hour, and after it, a fresh set of clothes in the correct size, which told her that someone had been paying attention to things like her clothing size, which was either thoughtful or unsettling, and she had not yet decided which. Corin had said nothing beyond what was necessary when he brought her here. He was a man who used words carefully, like someone aware that each one had weight, and she respected that. At the door, he had stopped and said, "Is there anything you need?" with the tone of a man who meant it genuinely, and she had said no, "Thank you," and he had nodded, and closed the door quietly. The door was not locked. She checked. Not as a test, and not with any immediate intention. She was not going to run now, because running now would be meaningless. She was already found. There was nowhere to go that the king of this kingdom could not reach, and she was not a woman who made empty gestures. She checked the door, because she needed to know the difference between being held and being placed, and the difference mattered to how she would think about what came next. The door was not locked. She stood at the window and looked down at the garden. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the light was clean and cold, and the garden below had the careful, pruned look of something tended to consistently rather than loved. She found herself thinking of the garden at the Oren estate, her family's garden, the one she had stood in at 12 years old while the fire took the upper windows. That garden had been loved. Her mother had loved it. She had grown things in it that had no practical purpose, things that were simply beautiful, and she had moved through it in the mornings, with the unhurried pleasure of someone who understood that beautiful things were worth their own time. Serafina had not let herself think about her mother in a long time. She made herself stop thinking about her now. She sat down at the writing table and looked at its clean, empty surface. She had nothing to write with here. Her journal was in the medical wing, along with the handover document and everything else she had been working on for 3 weeks. She thought about the document with the particular frustration of someone whose work was unfinished, and whose means of finishing it had just been removed. She would ask Corin in the morning about returning to the wing, or at least having her materials brought to her. The border villages still needed the completed handover. That had not changed. She was still thinking about this when the king came in the evening. He did not knock. The door opened and he came in, and closed it behind him, and she rose from the chair and they stood on opposite sides of the room and looked at each other. He was controlled in the way she had come to expect from him, but she could see the edges of it now, the visible maintenance of composure, the jaw set slightly too still, the way his eyes had a quality to them that suggested things behind them were moving faster than the surface showed. "Sit down," he said. She sat, not because she was required to, but because standing when he was standing seemed like the wrong choice for the conversation they were about to have. He remained standing. "Tell me," he said. The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. She recognized it. The quality of someone who had been holding questions back for hours and had arrived at the moment where they had to be asked, and had decided to collapse all of them into 2 words. She told him. She had decided, somewhere in the afternoon, that she would tell him everything, not because she had to, not because she was afraid of what he might do if she withheld anything. She had managed his father's kingdom's threat for 6 years, and she was not about to be reduced to compliance by fear of any individual man. She told him because the concealment was gone, and what was the point of a partial truth when the largest truth was already visible? She started at the beginning. She told him about House Aran, not the shape of it that he might have read in old documents, but the living version, the one she had grown up inside. Her father, who had been fair-minded and careful, and not interested in power beyond what was needed to protect what was his. Her mother and the garden. Her own training, begun early because the Aran bloodline was what it was, and children of that bloodline needed to understand it early so they could manage it safely. She told him about the elder Marin who had been her teacher. Then she told him about the night. She told it plainly, without decoration. She had been 12. The men in his father's colors had arrived with fire, and with a decree signed by 3 High Council members, and countersigned by the king himself. The decree said that House Aran was to be dissolved for conspiracy against the crown, a charge that her father had been given no opportunity to answer, and that she, at 12 years old, and hiding in the garden while Marin pressed a seal into her skin, had understood was not a real charge but a convenient one. He listened to all of it without moving. When she reached the part about Marin, something crossed his face briefly and was controlled away. She watched it with the clear eyes of someone who was no longer bothering to look away. "I did not know," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not telling you this to accuse you. You were not king then. You were a child yourself. The men who signed that decree are dead," he said. "2 of them died before my father. The last died the year I took the throne. I know that too," she said. A pause. He was looking at her in a way she could not categorize, not with the sharp analytical attention she had come to recognize, but with something more open, something she could not place. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he asked. The question was quiet. Genuinely quiet, not an accusation shaped like a question, but a real one, carrying a real need to know. She looked at him honestly. "Not if I could help it." He absorbed this. "Why?" he said. "Because I could not know what you would do with it," she said. "Because your kingdom's hands are already in my family's destruction, and I have spent 6 years learning not to trust kings with information they might use to finish what was started. Because..." She stopped, and she found, unexpectedly, that the sentence had something difficult at the end of it, and she made herself reach it. "Because I was not ready to stop being Sarah Vine." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of something settling, the way water settles after something is dropped into it. He sat down in the chair across from her then. He sat the way she had seen him sit at the workbench in the medical wing, leaning forward, forearms on his knees, looking at her with the kind of attention that left no room for anything to slip past. "Aran," he said. "Yes. Your bloodline is older than mine. By several generations. Which means," he said carefully, that in terms of pure lineage, you outrank me. In terms of pure lineage, she said, equally carefully, yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, so quietly it was almost not for her at all, my wolf has been silent for 3 years. She said nothing. Since I came to the throne, he continued, my advisors have said it is grief, or the weight of the position. I did not have an answer for them. He paused. In the lower hall today, when I came around the corner and saw you, he stopped. She knew what he was about to say. She could feel it already, in the blood bond place, the place that had no wall on her side anymore. She could feel what had happened to him in that corridor, the way she could feel a shift in the air before rain. Wordlessly, certainly. He woke up, the king said, not to her, or not only to her, like something that had been waiting. The room was very quiet. You knew, he said. It was not an accusation. Yes, she said. How long? She thought about the square, and the morning light, and the way his eyes had found her. From the square, she said. The first morning. He looked at her with something that was not simple to name. It was not anger. It was something that had anger's heat and grief's depth and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been keeping things together by force of will for a very long time and had just encountered a fact he did not know how to file. You knew, he said again, and you were planning to leave. Yes, she said, without telling me. Yes. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and she watched him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. After a long time, he turned back. I am not going to pretend this is simple, he said. I would not believe you if you did, she said. Something moved through his expression, something that was not quite the non-smile she had seen at the workbench, but was in the same family. No, he said. I don't suppose you would. He walked to the door. He put his hand on it and paused in the way she had come to know as his particular habit, pausing at exits for the last thing. You are not leaving, he said. It was not unkind. It was a fact being stated, in the way he stated facts. She said nothing. We will speak again tomorrow, he said. I need to think. So do I, she said. He looked at her once more, that full, direct, complicated look, and then he opened the door and left. She sat at the writing table in the quiet room and looked at the closed door. She reached into her collar for the pendant, out of habit, and found only the empty chain and then the broken piece of metal at the end of it. She turned it over in her fingers. 6 years of hiding in this small, worn thing, and now here she was, in the palace, revealed, known, and still alive. She was still alive. She thought about the border villages. She thought about the document she still needed to finish. She thought about the king standing at his window in the dark 3 weeks ago, and the way she had heard him not sleeping. She thought about Marin's voice in the garden, 6 years ago, just long enough, if you are careful. She had been careful. She had been careful for 6 years, and it had brought her here, to this room, to this palace, to this impossible situation, and she was not certain what careful meant now. She was not certain what anything meant now, in this new version of the world, where her name was known, and the seal was gone, and the king's wolf had woken up. She folded her hands on the table. She would think clearly. She always thought clearly. She began to think. The palace had a way of knowing things before they were announced. By the morning after the lower hall, without any official word having been given, the feeling in the corridors had changed. Serafina felt it the moment Corin allowed her to return to the medical wing to collect her materials, the way people moved differently around her now, the way glances came and were quickly redirected, the way the orderly who brought her meals held himself with a new, slightly uncertain deference that had not been there the day before. Word moved in palaces, the way it moved in small towns, except faster. She collected her materials from the medical wing and returned to the East Room and worked. She had 2 days left on the handover document, and she intended to finish it, because the border villages still had people who were still sick, and the seal failing, and the king's knowledge of her identity did not change that by one single particle. She finished the document in a day and a half. On the second morning, Corin came to the East Room with a look on his face that she had learned to read as the expression of a man carefully calibrating what he was about to say. "The council is meeting this afternoon," he said. "I know," she said, because she had expected it. A revelation of this kind, a woman with the Oren bloodline living inside the palace walls for 3 weeks, was exactly the kind of thing councils existed to react to. "The king has asked that you remain in the East Wing during the meeting," he said. "Of course," she said. He paused. "He has also asked me to tell you that nothing decided in that meeting will be implemented without his direct authority. He wanted you to know that." She looked at Corin steadily. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded and left. She stood at the window. She had heard the council meeting beginning from across the courtyard. Not the words, but the sound of it, the particular quality of many voices in a room arguing with the kind of urgency that came from genuine alarm. She had not been invited, obviously. She was the subject of the meeting, not a participant in it. This was one of the oldest dynamics she knew, the people affected by powerful decisions being excluded from the rooms where those decisions were made. She was familiar with being excluded from those rooms. She also knew that whatever was said in that room, the king would do what the king decided to do. She had enough information about him by now to understand that a council was not a committee. He listened to counsel. He did not let it govern him. What she did not know was what he had decided. She found out an hour after the council meeting ended, when the king came to the East Room himself. He looked as though the meeting had been exactly as draining as she had expected it to be. There was a particular quality of controlled tiredness about him, not visible in any single feature, but present in the way he held himself, in the lines around his eyes. He sat down across from her without preamble. "Sessin has moved to have you removed from the palace," he said. "He has the support of 4 council members. He argues that your presence represents a political threat to the stability of the crown." "He is not wrong," she said. "Politically speaking." He looked at her. "You agree with him?" "I understand his position. Whether I agree with it depends on the definition of threat. I am not here to take anything from you. I came to treat an illness. That is all I came to do." "That is not all that you are, though," he said. She looked at him squarely. "No, it is not." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quietness, she could see him moving through something large and complicated, and heavy with the weight of choices that could not be unmade once made. "3 packs have sent requests for meetings since this afternoon," he said. "Word travels faster than horses, in some directions. 2 of them are requesting that I formally denounce you and confirm the original decree. The 3rd is requesting," he paused, and something shifted in his expression, "to know whether the rumors about a surviving Oren heir are true. The 3rd pack was allied with your family." She absorbed this. "Which pack?" He told her. She recognized the name. Old allies of her father. People she had met as a small child in the formal way of children meeting important adults, without fully understanding what she was witnessing. She had not thought of them in years. "What will you tell them?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she found herself very aware of the sound of the palace outside the window, the distant sound of the courtyard, the ordinary sounds of a place that continued regardless of what was decided inside its rooms. "I am going to tell the 2 packs that requested a denouncement that no such denouncement will be made," he said, and his voice was steady and entirely without ambiguity. "I am going to tell the 3rd pack that the rumors are true. I am going to stand in front of my council tomorrow morning and inform them that Lord Sessin is dismissed from his position, effective today." She stared at him. "And then," he said, "I am going to formally acknowledge that the decree signed against House Oren was corrupt, that it has been voided by my authority, and that Serafina Oren is under my personal protection." She sat very still. "You are going to lose allies over this," she said carefully. 2, he said. "I will gain 3. Those are acceptable numbers." "You are making a political decision," she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and he said, "I am making a correct decision. The political calculations are how I justify it to the people who require justification. They are not why I am making it." She held his gaze. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and between them, the thing that had no name and no wall was present and steady. "This will cause problems," she said. "Yes," he said. "Most correct things do." She looked down at her hands. The silver marking was visible on her forearm, in the light from the window. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked back up. "I was planning to leave," she said. "Before all of this, I had 10 pages left on the handover document, and then I was going to speak to Corin and find a way to go quietly." "I know," he said. "You could not have known that." "I could see it," he said. "The pace you were working at. The way you looked at the roads in the morning. I knew you were counting something." He paused. "I did not know what." She thought about him at the window in the dark. She thought about 3 weeks of careful, deliberate invisibility, and the king who had quietly seen through the edges of it, not because he was looking for what she was, but because he was, in his particular way, attentive. "What do you want from me?" she asked. It was the most direct question she had asked him, and she asked it because she was done with indirection, and she suspected he was too. He was quiet for a moment. "I want," he said carefully, "to undo what was done to your family. I want to do that because it was wrong, and because I have the authority to undo it, and because doing nothing, when you can do something, is a choice I do not make." He paused. "And I want you to stay." The word landed in the room quietly. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Marin's hands on her face, and the feel of the seal going on, and the word careful pressed into her like a command. She thought about 6 years of running, of small rooms and assumed names, and the gray mare called Frost boarded at the edge of whatever town she was currently surviving in. She thought about the pendant, broken, lying in a drawer in the east room. She thought about the boy named Owen, whose fever had broken. "I will stay for now," she said, "not because I have been told to, because I choose to." He nodded. There was something in the way he received this that told her he had understood the distinction before she stated it, and that it mattered to him that she stated it anyway. "I will have your things moved to rooms in the main wing," he said. "The east room is fine. The main wing is more appropriate for your position." She looked at him. "What position am I in?" He met her eyes. "The one you were always supposed to be in," he said, and then he rose and left before she could answer, which she suspected was deliberate. She sat in the east room for a long time after. Outside the window, the garden caught the afternoon light. She thought about her mother, and the garden that had been loved. She did not make herself stop. There were exactly 4 people standing in the hall when the formal announcement was made. Serafina had not been asked to stand there. She had been in the corridor outside the main hall, having been told by Corin that the king had asked her to be present, but had left the choice of position to her. She could stand inside or wait outside, or not attend at all, and none of these choices would be held against her. She had stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the sound of the gathered court on the other side of the door, and then she had opened the door and walked in. Not to the front. She stood along the side wall, where she could see clearly, without being the center of what was being seen. Old habit. She had spent 6 years cultivating the ability to witness things from a slight angle. The hall was full. Every council member who had not been dismissed, every PAC representative currently at the palace, every senior member of the household staff who had been summoned. They stood in the long hall under the high windows, and there was the particular quality in the room of people who had been told something significant was about to be said, and had brought all their tension with them. The king stood at the head of the hall. She watched him. He had not looked for her when she came in. She did not know whether he had seen her. He was looking at the assembled court with the expression she now recognized as his working face, the one that had clarity at its center, and everything else arranged around that clarity in careful order. He began to speak. He did not start with the decree. He started with the plague, with the border villages, with the illness that had spread through 3 communities, and the healer who had been brought to treat it. He described the outcome, the patient counts, the recovery rates, the villages stabilizing. He named the healer, not Sarah Vine, Serafina Oren. The hall went so quiet that she could hear the sound of the wind against the windows. He then said what needed to be said, plainly, without preamble, without the softening language of someone trying to make a hard thing easier to digest. The decree signed by his father's council had been corrupt. The evidence of the conspiracy charge against House Oren had been fabricated by parties who stood to gain from the family's removal. He had reviewed the original documents. He was voiding the decree. House Oren was formally restored. He paused. The last surviving member of House Aron, he said, is Serafina Aron. She is under my personal protection. Anyone who disputes this is welcome to present their case to me directly. Another pause. I would not recommend it. The hall remained still. Serafina stood against the wall. She had expected to feel something complicated when this moment came, if it came. She had imagined it many times in the small hours of many nights over 6 years. The hypothetical moment when someone with authority said publicly that what had happened to her family was wrong. She had imagined it would feel like victory, or grief, or relief, or some mixture of all three. What she actually felt was simpler than any of those things. It felt like a door being placed where there had been no door. Not opened yet, just placed. She had not moved from the wall. Across the hall, the king found her with his eyes. She did not know how he knew exactly where she was. The hall was full of people, but he found her without searching, the way his gaze had found her in the square on the first morning, with that precise, immediate quality of recognition. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and neither of them moved, and the court stood between them, making the sounds of people beginning to absorb something they were going to be thinking about for a very long time. He looked at her as though he was checking something. She gave him the smallest, most controlled nod she was capable of. Something in his face settled. He looked back at the court and continued. The fallout came within 48 hours, exactly as she had predicted it would. 2 PAC ambassadors formally withdrew their alliances. They sent written notices rather than speaking to the king directly, which told Serafina something about their assessment of the situation. They were registering opposition without risking a face-to-face confrontation with a man they were not sure they could manage. The notices arrived by rider at sunrise and were brought to the king before breakfast. She was in the main wing by then. She had moved there 2 days after the announcement, not because she had been pressured, but because staying in the East Room had started to feel like refusing to finish crossing a room she was already in the middle of. The rooms in the main wing were large and quiet, and faced west, which meant the mornings were cool and the evenings were bright. And she had spent her first morning there, standing at the window for longer than was probably practical, adjusting to the size of the space. She heard about the withdrawals from Corin. "How is he?" she asked. Corin considered this question for a moment, in the careful way he considered all questions. "Exactly as you would expect him to be," he said finally. She thought about this, undisturbed. She said, "Yes," said Corin, and there was something in his tone that was not quite amusement, but was in the same direction. She went to find the king. She found him in the war room, which she had not been in before but which she located by the sound of a single person in a large room that was made for decisions, which had a particular quality of presence and weight to it, even through the door. She knocked once, which was a courtesy she offered because she had been raised with them, and then she opened the door. He was at the map table. There were papers spread across it, and he had been reading them, and he looked up when she came in with the unsurprised expression of a man who had been expecting her, though she had not told him she was coming. "You heard," he said. "Yes," she said. She came to stand at the edge of the map table. She looked at the withdrawal notices without touching them. "You should know that 3 allies are better than 2. The 3rd pack has already sent confirmation." "They have," he said. He had not looked back at the papers. He was looking at her. "You are not troubled by this," she said. It was not a question. "The 2 packs that withdrew were always conditional," he said. "Their alliances came with a long list of what they required in exchange for them. Losing them simplifies things considerably." She looked at him for a moment. "You are saying losing them is convenient." "I am saying," he said carefully, "that I did not factor them into my decision, because factoring them in would have meant making the wrong decision. The calculations came after." She absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map on the table. It was a detailed map of the kingdom and the territories around it, with markings and notes in what she assumed was the king's own hand, small, precise, without embellishment. "I want to go back to the medical wing," she said, "not permanently, but the handover document is finished, and I would like to make sure the palace healers understand it before I step back from the cases." "Of course," he said. "And I would like to write to the elder in Henwick," she said. "Graham. I told him I would follow up. Use whatever paper and messenger you need," he said. She nodded. She looked at the map one more time, and then she looked at him. "You made a correct decision," she said. He held her gaze. "I know," he said, without arrogance, with simple certainty. She went back to the medical wing. She spent 3 hours there, walking the palace healers through the handover documents section by section, answering questions, making notes in the margins where clarification was needed. It was satisfying work, the kind of work that had a clear completion point, a moment where you could step back and know the thing was done. She liked that about it. When she was leaving the wing for the last time as its primary healer, one of the older healers, a woman named Ruth, stopped her at the door. "The people in Henwick have been asking about you," Ruth said. "Not about the treatment, about you, whether you would come back." Serafina looked at her. "Some of them want to meet the person who helped them," Ruth said. "I think they want to say thank you properly." She thought about Graham and his red-rimmed eyes, and the note he had sent about the children sitting up and asking for bread. "I will visit," she said, "when the roads are good." Ruth nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Serafina stood at the door of the medical wing for a moment in the corridor, looking at it. She had spent 23 days walking through this door with a concealed name, and a hidden nature, and a plan to leave before any of it became a problem. She had been so careful. She had been so deliberately contained. She was still herself. She had not lost the precision, or the clarity, or the quality of attention that 6 years of careful living had given her. But she was also, for the first time in 6 years, not running from anything. That was new. She was still learning the dimensions of it. She walked back toward the main wing in the evening light, and the palace around her was ordinary and alive with the sounds of people doing the things that people in palaces did at the end of the day. And she moved through it without hiding the shape of her, without pulling herself in, or managing the angle of her eyes, or thinking about exits. For one moment, just one, she let herself simply walk through the place where she was. The main wing corridor in the evenings had a particular quality of light. The western windows caught the last of the sun and spread it across the stone floor in long bars of gold, and she walked through them without stepping around them, and the silver quality of her own nature caught the light and gave it back in a slightly different color, and no one who passed her in the corridor looked away. She stopped at her own door. She stood there for a moment. She had a door. She had a room behind it. She had a window that faced west and caught the light in the evenings. She had a kingdom that now knew her name. She thought about Marin. She thought about what Marin had said in the garden. Long enough, if you are careful. She had been careful for 6 years, and it had been long enough. She opened the door and went in. 3 weeks later, the border villages were declared recovered. All 3. The last of the sick had pulled through, including 2 patients that Serafina had privately worried about during the worst days of the illness. She received the news in a letter from the lead healer she had trained in Henwick, and she read it at the writing table in her rooms in the main wing, and she sat with it for a while in the early morning light. She had saved every person. Not alone. The palace riders and the local healers and the resources the king had mobilized had all been necessary. But the knowledge had been hers, and she had brought it here, and because she had brought it here, those villages were whole again. She thought about the specific weight of that. She thought about it the way she thought about all the things that mattered to her, quietly and completely, and without any need to share it with anyone, in order for it to be real. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the writing table. The palace had changed around her over the past weeks, or perhaps her perception of it had changed. She moved through it more freely now. The people who had been uncertain about her in the early days after the announcement had gradually, one by one, reached some internal conclusion and settled. Some of them were simply adjusting to the political reality. Others, she suspected, had decided something about her on their own terms, separate from the politics. Ruth from the medical wing had taken to stopping in the corridors to exchange a few words when their paths crossed. The orderly who brought her meals had started leaving small extra items on the tray, a piece of fruit, a jar of something sweet, without comment, and she accepted these without comment, because she understood the language of small gestures and what they communicated. She was becoming, slowly, someone this place could recognize. She was not sure yet how she felt about that. She was walking through the main courtyard on a cold, bright morning, on her way to check on the progress of a medicinal herb garden she had persuaded the palace groundskeeper to establish along the south wall, when the king fell into step beside her. He did not announce himself or say her name. He simply appeared at her side, and she adjusted to his presence without missing a step. because she had also adjusted to the fact that this was simply something he did. "The third pack's representative arrives tomorrow," he said. "I know, Corin told me. They have asked to meet with you directly." She glanced at him. "With me." "You are Oren," he said simply. "They want to look at you and know it is true." She thought about what it meant to be looked at in that way, not by someone searching for what was wrong with her, but by someone searching for what was there. The difference was significant. "All right," she said. They walked together past the stables, and the horses in the yard turned to watch the way horses do, with that particular large-eyed, curious attention. She had visited Frost twice since arriving at the palace. The gray mare had been brought from Mirenvale, because she had asked, and it had been done without question, which still slightly surprised her. Frost was in the third stall from the end, contentedly taking up space and accepting apple slices from the groom who had decided, apparently, that the mare deserved them. "Can I ask you something?" the king said. She looked at him sideways. In 6 weeks of increasingly direct conversation, he had never prefaced a question this way. He simply asked things. "Yes," she said. "The morning in the square," he said. "When we first arrived in Mirenvale. You looked at me, and then you looked away." "Yes," she said. "You knew then." "Yes," she said. "And you went inside the clinic anyway, and you came out anyway, when Clara told you we were asking for a healer." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They had reached the south wall, and the herb garden was there in its early stages. Small planted rows, a few things already establishing, the rest still to come. She looked at it. "Why?" he said. She considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, and she found the honest answer was simpler than she would have predicted. "Because the people in the border villages were sick," she said, "and I knew how to help them, and that mattered more than whether it was safe for me." He absorbed this. "You could have refused," he said. "You could have said you did not know the illness. I would not have been able to prove otherwise." "I could have," she said. "But you did not." "No," she said. Another quiet moment. The wind came over the south wall and moved through the small planted rows, and she watched it. "I almost let you leave," he said. Not quite an accusation. Something more like the admission of a mistake, stated plainly, without the protective covering of excuse. She looked at him. "You did not." "I very nearly did," he said. "The morning of the council vote, I sat in the meeting and listened to Sesson argue, and I thought—" He stopped. He started again. "I thought about what it would mean to simply do the politically simple thing, to send you away quietly, and let the problem resolve itself." She kept her eyes on his face. "And then I thought about you in that corridor," he said, "with the light coming off you, and your spine absolutely straight, and that broken chain in your hand, and you saying now you know, like it was the least important thing in the world." He paused, and I realized the only thing I was actually afraid of was that I would do the wrong thing, and you would not be there to see me do it. She was quiet for a moment. "That is not nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." They stood at the south wall, in the cold morning light, the small herb garden between them and the rest of the palace, and the silence between them was not empty. It had texture to it. Weight and warmth, the particular quality of a silence that contains everything two people have been building toward each other, across 6 weeks of proximity and honesty, and the slow, careful work of being known. "I am still learning what this is," she said. "What I am here, in this place. Who I am, now that Sarah Vine is not needed anymore." "So am I," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not performative, the genuine admission of a man who was also in the middle of something he did not have all the answers to. "I have been a king who ran everything alone for 4 years. I do not know yet what it looks like to not do that." She looked at him steadily. "Then we are both figuring something out," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, the small, precise nod she had given him in the hall at the announcement, and she turned back to look at the herb garden. "The rosemary is already establishing well," she said. He looked at the garden. "Is that good?" "It is very good," she said. "Rosemary is stubborn. It does not need much. Once it decides to take root, almost nothing can pull it out." He looked at it for a moment. "That sounds familiar," he said. She said nothing, but she allowed herself the edge of something that was not quite a smile, or perhaps it was. in the way that things became possible slowly, the way plants established themselves, the way roots went down before anything appeared above the surface. She had been many things in her life. A daughter, a fugitive, a healer with a borrowed name, a woman who had survived what had been meant to end her. She did not know yet what came next, but she was standing in the morning light, in the open air, with her real name on her real lips, and her real nature visible at the edges of her, and the world was not ending because of it. That was, she thought, a very good place from which to begin. The coronation happened on a quiet morning in early spring, with the garden in full color, and the kind of light that came through thin cloud, and made everything look considered rather than accidental. She had requested it to be quiet. The king had agreed without argument, which still sometimes surprised her, not that he agreed, but the ease with which he deferred to her preferences in the things that were genuinely hers to decide. She was learning that this was a particular quality of his. He was not, at his center, a man who needed to control everything. He was a man who needed to understand everything, which was different, and in some ways harder, and in other ways easier to live alongside. There were 12 people in the garden when the elder from the city's old council, an ancient man named Geoffrey who had known House Aron and wept quietly when he arrived, placed the second crown beside the king's, not below it, beside it. She had been clear about this, and the king had been the one who had made it formally so, in the documents signed 3 weeks earlier that established the structure of what they were building. Not a queen who derived her position from association. The Aron bloodline had its own sovereignty, older than the current throne's lineage, and she was what remained of it, and she was not going to disappear into someone else's title, after spending 6 years fighting to remain what she was. The king had read the proposed documents, looked up at her, and said, "This seems right to me." She had said, "Good." They had looked at each other for a moment, in the way they sometimes did, the way she was getting used to, that direct, unhurried quality of mutual recognition, and then they had both returned to the documents. Now she stood in the garden with the late morning light on her, and old Geoffrey's hands were slightly trembling as he placed the crown, and the 12 people watching included Corin and Ruth, and the orderly whose name was Lewis, and who had finally told her so, 3 weeks after she arrived in the main wing, as though he had been waiting for the right moment, and Clara, who had made the journey from Mirenvale, and was standing near the back, with her hands folded, and the expression of someone who had always suspected something, but had been kind enough not to say so. She looked at the king. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned over the past weeks to read, the one that was not simple, and was not soft, but contained something real and warm beneath its careful surface, the way deep rivers ran warm in places no one could see from above. She looked back at him with the same steadiness. There was no performance here. That was what she had asked for, and what she had been given. No audience to manage, no court to perform clarity for. 12 people who already knew the shape of what this was, and a pair of crowns in the garden, and the spring light coming through thin cloud, and a 6-year-old silence finally, fully, over. Geoffrey said the words, she said what she needed to say, the king said what he needed to say. The wind moved through the garden the way wind does, without asking anyone's permission, touching the rosemary along the south wall, and carrying the smell of it briefly across the ceremony. She thought of her mother. She let herself think of her, clearly and completely, the way she had let herself think of her since the night in the East Room, when she had stood at the window, and stopped making herself stop. Her mother in the garden she had loved. Her mother's hands in the soil. Her mother's voice saying her name, her real name, in the warm, unself-conscious way of a person who has never had to hide anything about the person they love. She felt the tears, and she did not prevent them, and they came and went in the time it took to finish a breath, and she was steady. The crown settled on her head. It was lighter than she had expected. She had imagined, when she imagined this at all, that such a thing would feel heavy. The weight of a name reclaimed, the weight of a history survived, the weight of a position she had not asked for, and had not planned to inhabit. She had expected to feel the full substance of all of it pressing down. What she actually felt was simpler. She felt settled. The same way the rosemary settled along the south wall, quietly and without ceremony, roots going down, deciding to stay. Afterward, when it was over, and the 12 people had gathered briefly around the small table in the garden where Clara had arranged refreshments in the practical, quietly loving way of someone who had known that flowers were not enough and that people needed to eat, The king appeared at her side. He did not say anything immediately. He stood beside her and accepted a cup from Lewis and looked out at the garden. "Well?" he said after a moment. She looked at him sideways. "Well?" she said. He was not, by nature, a man given to speeches. She had learned this about him, that the things he needed to say, he said, and he did not wrap them in more than they required. She had come to find this quality restful, in the way that honest things are restful after long exposure to things that are not. "I was wrong about a great many things," he said. Not with excessive guilt. He was also not a man given to that kind of suffering, which she respected, just as a statement of fact. "About you, specifically. For the first 3 weeks you were here, I thought you were a healer with unusual knowledge and a private history. I thought you were interesting. I thought," he paused slightly, "I thought my wolf was malfunctioning." She looked at him fully. "Malfunctioning. In the sense that it was responding to something I had not identified," he said, "which felt like a malfunction because I like to understand what things are responding to." She felt the edge of a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "And now? Now I understand what it was responding to," he said. 3 years of silence, and the moment you stepped out of that clinic, it started moving again." He looked at his cup. "I sat with that for a long time. The question of how I missed it for 3 weeks. How I kept coming to the medical wing, and kept talking to you and kept—" He stopped. He started again. "I thought I was coming for professional reasons, to monitor the progress of the treatment." "You were not," she said. "No," he said, "I was not." She thought about the first morning at the workbench, when he had sat across from her and asked her to read him the report. She thought about his footsteps in the medical wing at unusual hours. She thought about the corridor outside her sleeping room late at night, and how she had lain on the narrow bed listening to him stand there without knowing why he was there. "You were working something out," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am generally better at working things out than that." "To be fair," she said, "the situation was unusual." He looked at her with that deep, not quite smiling expression. "Serafina." She looked at him. "I realized too late," he said, "that you were already the most important person in the room every time you were in the room. I looked at you, and I saw a healer doing her job. I did not see it clearly until you were standing in that corridor, with the light coming off you. And even then—" He stopped. He looked down at his cup and then back at her. "I was angry. For a day, I was genuinely angry, and I am not certain the anger was about the concealment." She understood. She had thought about this too. "You were afraid you would lose something before you had named it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it was." She turned to face him more fully. Around them, the 12 people moved in the soft way of people who understood that some things needed their own space. "I am still here," she said. He looked at her. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I had my exits planned. I had Frost boarded, and the bag packed, and the document drafted. I had everything ready." She held his gaze. "And I stayed. Because of the border villages," he said. "Because of the border villages," she agreed. "And then, because honesty was the only currency she dealt in now. And because of you." The garden was very quiet. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "You saw it when you saw it," she said. "And you acted when you saw it. That is what matters." He looked at her for a long time, in the way that contained everything that had passed between them. The clinic door, the lower hall, the east room at night, the war room with the maps, the south wall and the rosemary, the documents signed and the council faced, and the 2 packs that had walked away, and the 3 that had stayed. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked out at the garden. The rosemary along the south wall was catching the spring light, green and definite, exactly as she had said it would be. Stubborn, established, not going anywhere. "I need to write to Henwick," she said. "I promised Graham I would visit when the roads were good." "The roads are good," the king said. She looked at him. "We could ride out this week," he said, "if you want company." She thought about Henwick, about the low houses and the children who had been sick, and the elder with his red-rimmed eyes. She thought about riding back there, not as Sarah Vine moving quietly through a border town, but as herself, as Serafina Oren, with her real name and her real face, and a man who had chosen to stand beside her. "All right," she said. He nodded. They stood in the garden together, in the spring light, and the day moved around them in the ordinary, irreplaceable way of days that are not dramatic and are better for it, full of small sounds, and the smell of rosemary, and the presence of people who had chosen, one by one, to remain. Serafina had spent 6 years making herself small enough not to be noticed. Now she stood in the open, in the light, in the place she had always been meant to be, and the world had not ended. It had, as it turned out, only just begun.